All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Injustice for All with Judge Joe Brown. And today we're going to be talking about immigration. I want to play this clip. It's Stephen Miller. And basically, they have a problem with the 1965 Hart and Seller Act. However, I want to play this clip and I want you, Judge, to go into details about the Immigration and Nationality Act, i.e. Hart-Seller Act.
My next guest has been a driving force behind President Trump's immigration policies. He is White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, Stephen Miller. Stephen, great to see you. You know, the interesting thing about hearing from a guy like Gene Simmons right there and what he had to say, when you do talk to someone who is either the child or the direct legal immigrant to the United States, they often share that type of love of America. Wherein when we look at an illegal population, you don't often hear that same type of patriotism.
Well, first of all, thank you for having this conversation, Will. I think there's been an incredible lack of honest, truthful, candid conversation in American media for a very long time about immigration policy. And you're right, of course, that immigrants who come here illegally engage in an act of spite against America from the moment they cross that border, and they continue to break our laws and flout our system and defy our rules every single day they're here, and continue to plunder and pillage off the system. And of course, their children, as a result of so-called birthright citizenship, which is the greatest scam in history, get unlimited welfare for life that goes to the benefit of legal alien parents. But I want to address your monologue specifically about the 1965 Immigration Act and what that means in American history. So during the civil rights era, and this is the simplest way I can put it, there was a thought in effect, if you go back and you can read the transcripts of the debate at the time, of applying civil rights to immigration policy for the globe and to create a civil right for people from every part of the world to come to America in ever-growing numbers. And so a system that for years, as you mentioned, had been tightly restricted, suddenly established this global ability of people in every part of the world to come to America, to bring their families to America, and then eventually empty out their entire towns and their entire villages to the United States of America. And so what you saw between 1965 and today was the single largest experiment on a society, on a civilization that had ever been conducted in human history. Not just the 76 million immigrants that were brought in, largely from the third world, but their descendants too. So you see with a lot of these immigrant groups, not only is the first generation unsuccessful, again, Somalia is a clear example here. Not only is the first generation unsuccessful, but you see persistent issues in every subsequent generation. So you see consistent high rates of welfare use, consistent high rates of criminal activity, consistent failures to assimilate. But this shouldn't be a surprise, Will. It's just common sense. If Somalians cannot make Somalia successful, why would we think that the track would be any different in the United States? Go third world country by third world country. No one's saying, look, there are people all over the world that are great people. But you look at the society. If Libya keeps failing, if the Central African Republic keeps failing, if Somalia keeps failing, right? If these societies all over the world continue to fail, you have to ask yourself, if you bring those societies into our country and then give them unlimited free welfare, what do we think is going to happen? You're going to replicate the conditions that they left over and over and over again. And we mask the impact of immigration in every public policy issue we discuss. We talk about test scores.
Okay. I wanted to pause it right there. So he was saying the 1965 Immigration Act. That it was basically it's a problem. And
his argument's crap, but the gist of it is this. Let's say that you've got a big body of people that is transferred to a high school, and a bunch of them want to join the football team, but they don't know the rules to the game of football. So the question presents itself, how are they going to play football if they don't know what they're supposed to be doing? Answer is, well, you played soccer where you were, but you've never played American football. So how are you going to go out on the field and play a team sport where you don't know the rules? You don't have any leaning of what you're supposed to be doing when you do this. It doesn't work too well. Now, he's talking about legislative history. The big problem with the whole birthright citizenship thing is that the 14th Amendment, as it addressed that issue, was trying to overturn the effects of a very foul decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, one of the worst it's ever made, known as the Dred Scott decision, that said Negroes could not be citizens. So that constitutional amendment, a portion of it, sort of changed American law so the Negro, the former slave, could be a citizen. It was never intended to deal with a situation where somebody planted a poisonous tree and wanted the fruit of the poisonous tree to have full advantage. In other words, if you came here illegally, you should not be allowed to have your crime prosper. The problem with coming right out and attacking it is it's going to require some very sophisticated manipulation of law to do it, because if you do that with the 14th Amendment, what you wind up doing is you also open up the 15th Amendment to being adjusted for the same reason. And if you do that, you knock out every corporate protection that every entity that trades on Wall Street enjoys. You destroy the structure of the American corporation, which was enabled to get the situation it has established because of the 15th Amendment, which again was designed to be for the benefit of former slaves. So that is something that will require some manipulation. The law is what it is, and you do one thing, you might put into place something else entirely that you don't want.
Well, I want to highlight the 1965 Immigration Act. And that was the pivotal Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, Hart-Celler Act, which abolished discriminatory national origin quotas, replacing them with a system prioritizing family reunification and skilled workers.
Nice, except there's one problem with it. It's not constitutionally sound. And the rule on that is Marbury versus Madison, an 1803 U.S. Supreme Court case that's 222 years old. Now, that says essentially that if an act of Congress does not comply with the requirements of the Constitution, it is null and void. So that act we're talking about in 1965 would arguably be subject to a declaration of nullity and voidness because it is in effect subject to the same sanctions that Marbury versus Madison was. Madison was the U.S. president. Marbury got an appointment to the position of Postmaster General for his area. And Madison said, oh, hell no, I'm not going to allow that. Somebody appointed him on his last day in office. I'm not going along with it. So the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the act that allowed Marbury to be appointed Postmaster General for his area under the circumstances did not comply with the Constitution. Therefore, President Madison was not obligated to follow it. Anyway, that's ancient law for America. And the problem is if you evoke it, you've got a real live mess for a lot of law that comes out of it. So the 1965 Act would strip the constitutional authorizations and assignment of responsibility for immigration policy and national diplomacy from the president and vested in Congress, which is not what the Constitution says. The chief administrative officer for the country is also the chief diplomat. That would be the president.
Well, I want to read a little bit more of this 1965 Immigration Act. It says fundamentally reshaping U.S. demographics by opening doors to non-European immigrants alongside the parallel end of the Mexican Barcero program, which spurred later undocumented migration. Now, here are key aspects of the 1965 Act. It abolished quotas, ended the restrictive national origin quotas that favored Northern Europeans, a system in place for 40 years. Because prior to that, it was majority European immigrants coming in. And so that allowed to get rid of a discriminatory quota. The new preference system established preferences for immigration based on family ties to U.S. citizen residents and needed skills, professional scientists, artists, etc. Family reunification prioritizes spouses, children, and siblings of U.S. citizens, fostering new immigration streams from Asia and Latin America. Skilled workers, including provision for skilled and unskilled workers in high demand fields. Civil rights context. Passed during the civil rights movement, it aimed to remove racial bias from U.S. law, aligning immigration policy with broader equality goals. And that was one of the stipulations after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The movement also fought and pushed Black Americans for them to revise the Immigration and Nationality policies, which came about the Hart and Seller Act, to relieve these quotas, these discriminatory quotas, so that you can get people from, whether it's the Caribbean, South America, or whatever country in Africa, more people other than just Europeans. Because before that, it's a tiny sprinkle of people throughout the diaspora compared to the millions of white immigrants that were allowed to come in. And so now fast forward to today, when we have the Somalis in Minnesota, and I wanted to ask you about the Somali. Are you familiar with the Somali refugee policy that when the United States went into Somalia and it was the Black Hawk Down? And so United States allowed Somalians to have a pathway here in the United States as a refugee, asylum seeker, and then a pathway to citizenship. Are you familiar with that?
I'm very familiar with it. It was a ridiculous situation. The mission that led to Black Hawk Down was designed to capture a certain Somali warlord whose son was a colonel, if I'm not mistaken, lieutenant colonel on the general staff, who was planning this raid. It was ill prepared, ill entered into, and done in a careless fashion. And it was a disaster, though some American soldiers got the opportunity to behave heroically. That's what came of it. But again, I read that as an unconstitutional act, even though it had good intents. Now, Congress could have controlled the money aspect of it, but making the law as it is, I don't think they had the constitutional authority to do that, because the articles in the Constitution are pretty clear when it comes to who's got the authority. Congress can control the purse, and whether or not that individual who is the president happens to have the financial wherewithal to do what he wants to do, that's one thing, but they can't control what he does. Now, the other problem that comes into play is back to what I said about you want to join the football team, but you have no idea what the rules are. I understand it looks racist, but that 1965 Act is one of the reasons why now when you call for information, you have to press 9 or press 9 if you want to hablar en español. Or I went through 3 terminals at one of the airports in Florida trying to find somebody who worked there who could speak English. And we have the model of the absolute ridiculous mess in Canada where everything has to be printed in English and French. And when you go down the street, you see 2 things on a street sign, the French spelling of the name and the English spelling of the name. Now, English itself is used from Beijing in China to Moscow in Russia to Paris, France to Pretoria, South Africa, when it comes to controlling international and seaborne traffic. So it is the international language, but for some reason in the United States, we're drifting off into being a bilingual nation. And you can see it when you have a federal form. You get to the box that says, are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic? If you are Hispanic and you check that, you skip all the next several boxes. But if you say non-Hispanic, you have to designate whether you are white or Caucasian, black or African American, and then it goes through the list all the way to Pacific Islander and a number of other things, or you decline to answer. So that's where we're going with that 1965 Act. And quite frankly, when you start hearing the Black Caucus talk about the racist aspects of it, I'm not privy to a great number of African Americans, black folk, FBA, or whatever somebody wants to call themselves, who are fluent in Espanol, except perhaps if you were in certain places in Harlem designated as Spanish Harlem, when there was a huge Puerto Rican influence, and still is Spanish Harlem, they called it. Now, there are some things that need to be straightened out because in this day and time, they create a lot of difficulty for the operation of the country. Now, one of the problems is DASH, D-A-S-H, it's spelled. And DASH, or DASH, depending upon who's saying it, is the acceptance of bribery as an ordinary process of politics. When you engage in contractual negotiations with anybody, corporate-wise or with the government, in Somalia, there is expected to be some money under the table. And in the American system with American law, that is just an anathema. That's against the law. So you have a group of people who was not required due to their refugee status to take the courses that would teach the new applicant for citizenship status these things and test him to see if he learned the lessons. Refugee status obviates the need to go through this, and a person gets automatic citizenship. So this takes away from the responsibilities and the obligations of the president to be the chief diplomatic officer who can propose agreements, which if they become formal are under Article 6, then part of the supreme law of the land that have to be enforced by all federal and state judges. Now, that formalization by treaty has not occurred. So the law or the legislation that Congress passes would fail under Marbury versus Madison, which would cause a number of problems.
I want to play the rest.
Now, that's complicated, excuse me. But sometimes, like if you watch John Wick, what does he say? It's complicated and there are consequences. America has been conditioned over the last 50 years to be indisposed to hearing a story out. They want a 5 to 15-second soundbite on something that's very, very complicated, and it doesn't work.
Well, if you subtract immigration out of test scores, all of a sudden our test scores skyrocket. If you subtract immigration out of healthcare, all of a sudden we don't have nearly the size of the healthcare challenges our country faces. If you subtract immigration out of public safety, all of a sudden we don't have violent crime in so many of our cities. Issue after issue, we talk about these things that they just happen to us. The schools just suddenly fail. Violent crime just suddenly explodes. The deficit just suddenly skyrockets. These are a result of social policy choices that we made through immigration.
And Stephen, I think the word choice that you just used sticks out to me. You said, when we import these societies, it's not the importation of individuals, but individuals in such a number that there's never a requirement and often even not a desire to assimilate. Then what you have done is import the previous society. Are there Somalis that can assimilate into the United States and be successful in this new world? Absolutely. But when it's done at such numbers that it's never a requirement and maybe not even a desire, then you can live in unassimilated communities in the United States. You never have a cohesive common bond with the existing nation, and you can live the way that you did in Somalia or in Central America.
And even worse than that, you end up with what our founding fathers feared the most, which is that you have foreign immigrants who become advocates, not for this country, but the country that they left. So you see, replete throughout Somali politics in Minnesota is this constant concern about how to reorient U.S. politics around Somalia, and then using welfare fraud, pillaging the U.S. financial system to prop up a foreign country. So in this case, the U.S. becomes an object not of patriotism, but of plunder. And when you're talking about assimilation, two things matter enormously: the numbers and how different the cultures are. So the further away in culture you go and the larger in number you go, by definition, the greater challenge it poses to assimilation.
Yes. So one last question, Stephen. I think you and I could have and should have this conversation at a much longer scale. This is something that is incredibly important and worthy of a half hour together. But such is the nature of television as it is right now. I'm working on that. But this will be quickly my last question for you. What can we do, Stephen? You know, this was something America addressed in the 1920s. They had these debates. They had these conversations openly, and they chose in the 1920s to say, we are going to put strict quotas on people coming from different parts of the world. 65 did away with what we did in the 20s. So do we need something like the 1924 Act?
Clearly, we need to have in this country exactly what President Trump called for, which is that we need a moratorium on immigration from third world countries until we can heal ourselves as a nation, solve our education issues, solve our healthcare issues, our public safety issues, our assimilation issues, our cultural issues. So the 1924 Act is such a good example because we had large scale immigration from Europe from 1880 to 1920. So in other words, we went from a country that had immigration from part of Europe to immigration from many other parts of Europe. But even other European countries pose enormous stresses on the U.S. system, both economically and in terms of security. There's a lot of crime, a lot of threats to public safety and order, and those were addressed with very strict immigration quotas. What they don't teach you in school is that from 1920 to 1970, there was negative migration. There was a half century of negative migration. The foreign-born population declined by 40% for half a century. During that same time period, the U.S. population doubled from natural childbirth. That was the cauldron in which a unified shared national identity was formed. They went through a depression together. They went through world wars together. They landed on the moon together. This great period in American history happened at a time when there was negative migration. They don't teach that to our kids in school. And frankly, I would submit very few politicians serving in Congress probably know that, Will.
Oh, man.
All right.
Okay, what happens is this. You're running afoul of the American proclivity to be egalitarian. In other words, equality. And yes, all of what he says is true, but his presentation sounds very bad. And he places his reliance on subjective matters, whereas the reality is there are objective criteria that are set up that have nothing to do with some of the problems that people are having with the immigration thing. I'll give you two examples. Both individuals are of German origin. Albert Einstein, who came up with special and general relativity that probably make him one of the greatest human minds ever for coming up with what he came up with, that so much of what we do today depends upon, that allowed us to end World War II expeditiously with the atomic bomb. The other example is Werner von Braun, or Braun in German, and he was a Nazi, an enthusiastic Nazi, but he had an education, the training, and the facility to be allowed in this country under what they called Operation Paperclip for a national security consideration, and he's responsible for us having the Atlas ICBM, Titan IBM, ICBM, Minuteman, Poseidon, Polaris, Poseidon, Trident missile systems, for the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space capsule programs for landing on the moon, and keeping the United States ahead of the Soviets in the long-range missile and space environment. So that helps. Now, you bring in somebody from Somalia, and you're talking about somebody who is, even by American standards, drastically undereducated. You're talking about somebody who assumes bribery is a natural and appropriate act of government in doing business. You bring in somebody that's got a very different cultural foundation when it comes to perspective on religion. You've got someone who has a very different value system when it comes to life and what is appropriate, and an almost incorrigible situation when it comes to cultural orientation as far as people in this country have come to accept. And that general thing goes to expectations, goes to being able to know effectively the rules of the road when it comes to living in this place. You rode around with me when you came and visited, and I was expressing my displeasure at people who, in their total ignorance of the rules of the road, would stop at the limit line when they were trying to make a left turn, and they would be stuck there through several lights. Whereas what the law says is if attempting to make a left-hand turn, one shall pull as near to the middle of the intersection as possible and await the clearance of oncoming traffic, which means if you happen to be there in that intersection when the light turns yellow, already stopped, and then red, and you make your left turn when the traffic clears, you've committed no violation. But people, because of these red light cameras, think that if you're in the intersection when the light turns yellow and then red, you'll get a ticket. You might, but it's not going to be a good ticket, and you shouldn't. So that is an example of the ignorance that causes a lot of traffic congestion and aggravation and road rage. Well, the same thing happens is when you bring someone in who has no understanding of the culture he's coming into, no understanding of the obligations and expectations, then you're going to have a lot of the equivalent of road rage, aggravation, and congestion in the way things are working. Now, the 1965 Act meant well, and perhaps the way Congress should handle it is the appropriate way, which is by the purse strings that they have in their hands. In other words, we simply won't appropriate money for doing it any other way than this, but you can't dictate what it is because there may be other policy considerations. Like when Truman went along with Operation Paperclip, he had knowledge that the Soviets were trying to quickly build the bomb because they had spies in the American system who were feeding them the information. And on close contact with Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England during World War II, he was aware of the threat, and right at that point, we had a situation that manifested the need, which was what led to the Berlin airlift, when the Soviets decided to test the fortitude of the West. So there are considerations that those who don't want to deal with anything that's not a 5 to 15 second soundbite just won't get. So we don't put them in the loop to handle things.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in to Injustice for All with Judge Joe Brown. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit that bell button to get all notifications. Bye.
Bye.